Over the years, Sean Diddy Combs has reportedly shelled out millions of dollars to keep his private life private. But now those supposed secrets are cracking wide open as witness after witness is taking the stand in his federal sex trafficking and racketeering case, detailing what they say happened behind closed doors and how much they were allegedly paid to keep quiet. I'm your host, Kennedi Walker, and you're watching Law&Crime. As week 4 of the Sean Combs trial gets underway, jurors aren't just hearing about crimes, they're hearing about the money Combs allegedly spent trying to cover them up. Combs has pleaded not guilty to all of the charges against him. The jury heard from Eddie Garcia, a former security officer at the Intercontinental Hotel, who testified Combs paid $100,000 to ensure that security footage showing him physically assaulting his then-girlfriend Cassie Ventura in 2016 never got out. Garcia initially invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, but ultimately testified under immunity. He told jurors that after the assault, he began receiving repeated phone calls at the hotel's security desk. On the phone, he says, was Christina Coram, Combs' chief of staff, whose name has surfaced repeatedly in witness testimony, though she has not been charged with any crime. Garcia testified that Coram eventually came to the hotel in person. He recalled her asking what exactly Combs was, quote, dealing with. The prosecutor asked, "How did you respond?" Garcia responded, "I apologized and said I was sorry, but I could not show her the video and that she could talk to hotel management or follow up with a subpoena." The prosecutor asked, "Did you tell her anything about what you had observed on the video?" Garcia responded, "Yes, I did mention to her that off the record, it's bad." Garcia said he alerted the hotel's general manager and director about the incident, but that wasn't the end. Garcia testified that later that night, his personal phone rang, and when he picked it up, it was Coram again. And this time, she handed the phone to Combs himself. Garcia told jurors that Combs said, "You sound like a good guy, like someone who wants to help. Something like this could ruin me." He said he brought that information to his supervisor, who then told him he'd be willing to hand over the footage for $50,000. When Garcia relayed that message to Combs, he says the music mogul responded, "Eddie, my angel, I knew you could help. I knew you could do it." Shortly after, Garcia says Combs gave him an address. When he showed up, Garcia says he was made to sign a non-disclosure agreement. Then, Garcia testified Combs pulled out a brown paper bag stuffed with cash and counted out $100,000 with a money counter. Garcia said he split that money with his boss and another security officer. And Garcia isn't the only one pointing to hush money. Another witness, a former employee identified only as Mia to protect her identity, told jurors she received a $400,000 settlement from Combs. Mia, who served as Combs' personal assistant from 2009 to 2017, told the court she endured years of physical and sexual abuse at the hands of her former boss. She also testified that after Cassie Ventura filed her explosive civil lawsuit, a member of Combs' security team tried to bribe her into silence. Mia said she originally planned to sue Combs for $10 million, but after entering mediation, she testified she settled for $400,000 and was required to sign a non-disclosure agreement. She's not alone. Capricorn Clark, another former employee, took the stand and accused Combs of kidnapping her, threatening her, and forcing her to undergo lie detector tests. She testified they also reached a financial settlement. But when prosecutors asked how much she received, defense attorneys objected and the judge sustained it, keeping the number off the record. Then came Carrie Morgan, Cassie Ventura's close friend, who told the jury Combs paid her $30,000 to sign an NDA after she says he assaulted her in 2018. Morgan alleged Combs choked her and hit her with a wooden hanger, causing a concussion. She said a month later, Cassie met her at a restaurant and handed her $30,000, asking her to sign the agreement on Diddy's behalf. But the largest known payout is Cassie's. Cassie testified that Combs paid her $20 million to settle her civil lawsuit, which accused him of rape and years of violent abuse. She too was required to sign a non-disclosure agreement. And this may be just the beginning. Since November 2023, at least 70 civil lawsuits have been filed against Combs. Now, the man who once boasted of being a bad boy for life is facing a reality he could go to prison for life. This is a Law and Crime legal alert. If you received Depo-Provera birth control shots and were later diagnosed with a brain or spinal tumor called meningioma, you may be eligible for a lawsuit. Morgan & Morgan is investigating claims that patients weren't properly warned about this risk. It's free to check, takes just a few minutes, and you don't pay unless they win. So scan the QR code on your screen, click the link below, or go to forthepeople.com/LCDepo to see if you qualify. And here to talk more about this with me is criminal defense attorney William Corman. William, thank you so much for coming on today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So we've heard a lot about payouts and NDAs. How much legal weight do those non-disclosure agreements actually carry in a criminal trial?
In a criminal trial, they really don't have that much legal weight at all. As a matter of fact, most NDAs have a carve out for either providing information to law enforcement or testifying in court. So they're interesting, they're important in lots of contexts, but it's next to impossible to draft an NDA that would prohibit somebody from either talking about a crime to law enforcement or talking about it in court if subpoenaed to testify.
Right. And sometimes I think some people don't think about that when they're making people sign these NDAs. Like, regardless, you can still go to jail if you do something illegal. So you bring up a good point there. But let's talk about credibility. How does a payout, especially one involving 6 or 7 figures like we've seen here, impact how a jury may see a witness?
Sure. Well, obviously, if a witness has a motivation to testify in one direction or another, and they received a payout, almost regardless of the amount, that can impact a jury. I mean, again, if someone's been given $50,000 to testify or to withhold evidence in one particular direction, and that comes out during the course of a trial, then obviously their credibility is going to get scuffed up quite a bit.
How do you, I guess, if their credibility is getting messed up, I'm just wondering, how does the defense try to combat that?
So in a situation like this, in Diddy's case, I think what the defense would do, or either side, quite frankly, would do, is talk about the power dynamic. So here we have one of the most powerful media moguls in the world, having individuals sign an NDA, individuals who they themselves probably are not very sophisticated in terms of the law or business. And here's this guy, here's Diddy coming forward and saying, look, I need you to sign this. And it's not a 2-paragraph piece of paper by any stretch of the imagination. So that power dynamic itself is making them sign it. So it's important to remember that when that power dynamic is put into play during the NDA, that can have an effect on individuals as far as their desire to sign it or feeling that they had to sign it. There could be some sort of compulsion to sign it simply because of who Diddy is when he's asking them to sign these documents.
So if a jury, if one of the jurors, they're, looking at Diddy, maybe like, is he guilty for making someone sign an NDA or, paying someone off? How can the defense still try to make their client seem not guilty?
So from a defense standpoint, I would say, look, during the course of business interactions, contracts are entered into all the time. And that's what these were. These were contracts. These were people that were hired by Diddy. These were contracts that they signed as terms and conditions of their employment. And that's why they signed them. And it's par for the course. And no one should read anything into it by having individuals sign an NDA in this particular case. Now, whether or not that actually holds any water, because we sometimes know what the NDAs what these people ended up having to do as a result of signing the NDAs, that's a different story entirely. But in a vacuum, just talking about the NDAs as a common everyday business occurrence is how I would approach it as a defense attorney.
Well, let's get into some of the testimony. Eddie Garcia, he was a security guard at the Intercontinental Hotel. He testified under immunity. Can you break down what immunity actually means in this context, and why does he need it? And does it mean that he's protected no matter what he says?
Sure. So witnesses sometimes are granted immunity or ask for immunity if their testimony is going to involve an admission of criminal wrongdoing. So Mr. Garcia, he had a couple of problems here. I mean, obviously, we know he lied to law enforcement about what he saw and what he did. He also had some conversations with his employer where he roped some fellow employees into sort of manipulating the tape and manipulating, not manipulating tape, but sort of giving the thumb drive to Diddy's folks. That certainly was outside the context of his employment. And he got paid to do these things. So he essentially got paid to break the rules, certainly at his job, and to give Diddy information. So by printing out or by downloading that thumb drive and giving it to Diddy's folks, he's hiding evidence. He's hiding evidence of what we all know was a particularly brutal assault. So in order to protect himself, his lawyers asked, and he received immunity, which means that he can't be prosecuted for anything that he says during the course of his testimony in this particular case.
What, if any, are the risks that prosecutors take when they put someone on the stand, like Mr. Garcia, who, they gave immunity to and who originally pled the fifth?
So when a witness has immunity and it comes out during the course of a trial, and it always does, it always comes out during the course of a trial, the defense attorney is able to essentially say, look, you yourself are involved in criminal conduct. You yourself are involved in criminal wrongdoing. And as a matter of fact, the only reason you're testifying here today is because the government is giving you a free pass. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you should take that into account. What does this person have to gain by testifying? In some instances, these people are able to admit to criminal conduct and subsequently not get charged by it or charged with it. So therefore, they may have a motivation in testifying in a certain way in order to avoid prosecution themselves.
And in this case, we know Mr. Garcia was given $100,000 to give Sean Combs a copy of that 2016 tape of him assaulting Miss Ventura. There are a lot of financial settlements coming up in testimony. Could prosecutors try to use those payouts to prove a pattern of obstruction or witness tampering?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, we know this. Diddy has a propensity towards violence. There's been witness after witness who've talked about these horrible, egregious, offensive, illegal, and immoral things that he did as part of his everyday life. And in order to get away with it, he was throwing money around left and right. So, of course, the prosecution is going to talk about it. And it does show, as you said so aptly, it does show that this is sort of how he did business. I can do whatever I want because I'm Diddy. And I'm either going to come at you by withholding professional services from you. I'm not going to release your albums if you don't do these things for me. Or I'm just going to throw money at you and hope my problem goes away.
And something that I found interesting was so far no one from Combs's inner circle has been charged. Could that change based on some of the testimony that we're hearing?
I think that at this stage of the game, if the prosecution was sort of dangling out the idea that if you don't cooperate, you're going to get charged, we would know that by now. So I think it's unlikely anyone else is going to be charged. Now, that's why these folks keep getting immunity agreements, because they're having to testify, they're having to admit their own criminal conduct, they're having to admit their own wrongdoing. And the prosecution knows who they can charge, they know what they can charge people with. And in order to get these folks to testify against who the government thinks is the true bad actor, Diddy, they're offering these immunity agreements, it seems, almost left and right.
Well, what about Christina Quorum? We know that she was Sean Combs's chief of staff. Her name has come up several times during this trial. Even though she hasn't been charged, could she eventually face legal consequences based on what we're hearing in court?
So I don't think, again, I think it's a little late for her to be charged. I think that we know that all sorts of folks in Diddy's circle were engaged in this criminal conduct. And again, that's one of the things the government needs to prove. They need to prove, in order to prove RICO, they have to show that there was sort of an organization that was involved in criminal wrongdoing. And there's no doubt whatsoever, at least in my mind, that all these various folks who were involved in Diddy's inner circle were complicit in this criminal conduct. Could they be charged? I suppose it's possible, but my guess is it probably would have happened already.
Could Christina Quorum testify against Diddy?
Sure. There'd be no prohibition against her doing so. Again, if I were representing her, I would probably want an immunity agreement for my client before I let her get on the stand. And that may very well have already happened. We simply don't know.
We know that, according to testimony from Eddie Garcia, Christina Coram was there when the whole situation with the tape happened and just trying to get that 2016 tape to Mr. Combs, and Miss Coram called Eddie Garcia, according to Mr. Garcia, several times. There's this line Garcia said, Combs telling him something like this could ruin me. How might prosecutors use that statement in their argument?
So it's an admission. It's an admission of wrongdoing. And again, we already know, look, Diddy got out in front of the tape. As soon as it started leaking, he put out an apology. So he already admitted his criminal conduct. But back then, before anyone even knew about the tape, he's already admitting to Garcia, look, I think I did something wrong here, or I did something wrong here, and it would ruin me if it got out. And that's an absolute admission against self-interest. He's admitting that he's done something wrong. And then after that, he's now throwing money around to try to solve the problem.
And Diddy himself, according to Garcia, paid Garcia in a brown paper bag. I mean, that itself just sounds like a movie scene. But
It
legally,
does.
how does cash complicate or help things in a case like this?
Well, we certainly know from Garcia's own testimony that he didn't declare any of this on his taxes. He got this money. I think he gave some to friends. I believe he said he bought a car. Cash transactions are sometimes a goldmine for the prosecution, because if this was all above board, why didn't it go through Bad Boy Records? Why didn't it go through any of Puffy's business enterprises? But cash in a paper bag, I mean, there's a salacious component to it that's what a prosecutor loves. Again, you can't turn around and say, look, this was how we did business every day, if you're handing out cash in paper bags, hundreds of thousands of dollars in paper bags.
Well, I guess on the other side of that, we know that Mr. Combs is a very wealthy man. So could he argue that, oh, it had nothing to do with Combs Enterprises, I took money out of my own personal bank account and gave it to Mr. Garcia?
Sure, but again, let's remember what the money is for. The money is to, essentially obfuscate any investigation into this horrendous beating that we've all seen on video. So whether or not it's Combs as like you said, pulling money out of his bank account or being funneled through one of his business enterprises, it almost doesn't matter, because it's what the money is for that's the problem here. He's giving money to Garcia in order to get Garcia to give him this thumb drive and to assure him that it's the only video that's out there. So, he's playing with evidence. He's manipulating evidence. And again, it doesn't matter where the money's coming from. It's the conduct that the money is for that's the problem.
And other people are claiming that Mr. Combs gave them large amounts of money as well. The defense, they have been objecting a lot, like when Capricorn Clark was asked about her settlement. What does it tell us when a judge sustains that kind of objection?
Well, I mean, again, so we're watching this trial. We're interested in what's going on, but the judge's role is to make sure that the jury only hears evidence that falls within the rules of procedure. And consequently, judges often overrule objections or sustain objections, and the public doesn't quite understand why. Sometimes they sustain objections, and we all just really want to know what the answer to the question is. So it has a lot less to do with what we, the people, if you will, are interested in learning. It's what information is appropriate for the jury to hear. And those two things don't always match up. There's lots of times that we would love to know the answer to a question, but the answer to the question or the question itself is improper for the jury to hear or consider.
Well, any idea on why they wouldn't want us to know how much Capricorn Clark's settlement was?
I suppose the answer to that is every single thing that's happening in this case, again, shows Diddy's power dynamic with these various witnesses. And I think that the evidence will show that there was a settlement with Capricorn Clark. For the jury to hear exactly how much money that was, again, I would think as a defense attorney, I'd want to keep that out, because it shows that Diddy's way to resolve problems is just to throw money at these situations, throw exorbitant sums of money at these situations. And that was how he did business all day, every day.
Now, at this point, we've heard from hotel staff, assistants, other employees, some close friends. Does a mix of personal and professional witnesses help prosecutors build a more complete narrative?
Sure, because the personal witnesses, if you will, those folks sort of lend they lend sort of here and now is what's going on. This is what I saw. This is what was happening. This is what I observed. And the professional witnesses interwoven through sort of give the context within which it happens. So, for example, when we heard from the psychologist, and she was able to explain why victims of violence sometimes stay with their abusers for a significant period of time, that was very important in order for the jury to understand why, for example, Mia and Jane and all these folks kept returning back into Diddy's orbit. So those professional witnesses do provide context to explain why these people did what they did.
And also just like the legal strategy behind letting the jury hear multiple allegations of hush money. What is that about? Even if only one is directly tied to a charge, is that kind of sort of what you were saying, just making sure that they understand and showing that pattern?
Exactly, because the pattern is what matters here.
And let's talk about the defense. Diddy's defense team seems to be focusing on questioning motive, like suggesting that some of these witnesses are after his money. Does that usually work with juries?
It can. It can. I mean, again, I think the defense in this case has a pretty tough road to hoe here, simply because of the sheer volume of evidence here, and I think that it's an uphill battle. It's an uphill battle, to say the least. So I think questioning the motives is certainly important, but I think the defense strategy is going to shift to, look, there's no way to ignore the fact that Diddy is a violent guy. Again, the video speaks for itself. And just because he is a violent guy does not necessarily mean that he did all these things that the government is alleging. The government has the burden. The government has to prove the case against Diddy beyond a reasonable doubt. So is this a domestic violence case, as Diddy's lawyers suggest in their opening statement? That will be their argument. Look, he's committed some atrocious acts against these women, and that's terrible. It really is. But that doesn't necessarily mean that he's committed RICO violations, and that's what he's being charged with.
What was interesting, I would say, with the defense, they brought up, the Me Too movement a lot. They said that, this was a money grab. Some of the witnesses was a money grab. How do you, I guess, as the prosecution, try to combat that argument as well? If they're saying, hey, you never filed a complaint, but it wasn't until, Cassie filed her lawsuit, then you filed yours. And then, oh, well, how much money were you asking for? How much money did you ask for? How do you combat that if you are the prosecution? That, yes, all of these women are now, years after the fact, coming forward with these allegations and are filing lawsuits against Mr. Combs.
So I think it's a combination of two things. I think, first of all, you talk about the power dynamic between Diddy and all these individuals, and that he's the one who had all the power. And so consequently, they did whatever they said, or whatever he said. And then secondly, again, like the psychologist testified to, you provide context. You educate the jury as to why individuals who are in these horrible, abusive relationships stay in the relationships and can't get out. That's what I think the answer is.
We are 4 weeks into this trial. We still have a few more weeks left. Are there risks of witness fatigue for the jury, and how do prosecutors avoid that when building a case this complex?
That's a good question, and it's tough to answer. I will say this, having watched an awful lot of this trial, as I know you have too, the witnesses so far in this case, they've been pretty compelling, and they're telling some stories that are horrible to hear and difficult to hear for the jurors as well, I'm sure. This is not one of those cases where we're getting bogged down in financial minutia. This isn't one of those cases where we're getting bogged down in hyper-technical information. And that could be coming down the road, but at least as far as things seem now, each of these witnesses is telling a very compelling story. And I think the jurors, at least from what I've heard, the jurors are absolutely paying attention to it. So I think the prosecution has done a good job of, presenting some witnesses who have compelling and awful stories to share with the jurors, and then taking a step back, introducing law enforcement to sort of, again, provide that context, and then stepping back and having the more firsthand witnesses talk about what's going on. And I think the prosecution's been doing a good job with that ebb and flow of the trial. Could it eventually reach a breaking point for the jurors? Absolutely. But it's too soon to tell whether or not we're there.
Well, before I let you go, what should we be watching for next? Are there any red flags or turning points that could completely shift the outcome?
I suppose the question that everyone asks is Diddy going to testify? If I were his lawyers, I'd be saying, please don't. Nothing we can do about that. As defense attorneys, if individuals insist on testifying, we can't prevent them from doing so. That's the multi-billion-dollar question that's floating out there right now. Will he testify? And I think that that's going to be fascinating to see if they can keep him off the stand. I mean, obviously, we know that. He's testified in cases of his before. Again, the stakes were nowhere near as high as this. He's an individual who wants to let his story get out there. I mean, again, his apology shortly after that video came out, we all know that he's not afraid to get out there and put himself out in the public eye, even if it's in a negative light. So that will be interesting. And quite frankly, the closing arguments of the lawyers in this particular case, that's going to be must-see TV. Those are going to be fantastic summations. And I think there'll be a lot that we can learn from those.
Yes, we are all waiting to see if Sean Combs will testify. We know that Suge Knight spoke with our Anjanette Levy and said that he wants Mr. Combs to testify and thinks that it would be good for him and good for hip hop. So we will see what happens next. But William, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you again for having me.
Again, Sean Diddy Combs has pleaded not guilty to all criminal charges against him. And through his attorneys, he's denied all of the claims in the civil lawsuits filed against him. For Law and Crime, I'm Kennedi Walker.